morning sun was just starting to rise over New York City when David Chen walked into John F. Kennedy International Airport. He looked like any other traveler that day. He wore simple blue jeans, white sneakers, and a gray sweater. On his head sat a plain baseball cap. In his hand, he carried a small black backpack. No one would guess that he was the CEO of Skyline Airways, one of the biggest airlines in the country. David had been the CEO for 5 years now. He worked hard to build the company and make it successful. But lately he felt something was wrong. He sat in his big office every day, looking at numbers and reports. He talked to managers and executives, but he did not really know what was happening on his planes. He did not know how his workers treated customers. He did not know if passengers were happy or sad. Last week, David had received several angry emails. Customers complained about rude flight attendants. They said some workers were mean and unfair. David read these emails in his office, but he was not sure if they were true. His managers told him everything was fine. They showed him good reports and happy survey results. But David could not shake the feeling that something was being hidden from him, so he made a decision. He would fly on one of his own planes without telling anyone who he was. He would sit with regular passengers and watch everything with his own eyes. He would see the truth for himself. David checked in at the counter like everyone else. The woman at the desk smiled at him and gave him his boarding pass. She had no idea who he was. His ticket was for seat 24B in economy class. David wanted to sit in the back of the plane where most people sat. He wanted to see how his airline treated regular customers, not just the rich people in first class. He walked through security and waited at gate 17. Around him, families talked and laughed. Business people typed on their laptops. Children ran around while their parents tried to calm them down. David watched them all. These were his customers. These were the people who paid their money to fly with his airline. He wanted to make sure they were treated well. The gate agent announced that boarding would begin soon. David stood up and stretched his legs. He felt nervous but also excited. This was going to be an interesting flight. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was a big plane with over 200 seats. First class was at the front with large, comfortable seats. Economy class filled the rest of the plane with smaller seats packed closer together. David would be in economy today, just like most of his passengers. As people lined up to board, David noticed a man joining the first class line. The man looked to be in his early 40s. He was tall and well-built, with short black hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore an expensive dark blue suit that fit him perfectly. On his wrist was a watch that David recognized as worth at least $50,000. The man carried a brown leather briefcase that looked handmade and costly, but what David noticed most was the man's face. He looked calm and confident. He smiled politely at other passengers. When a small child accidentally bumped into him, he laughed kindly and helped the mother pick up the toys that had fallen. There was something dignified about him, something that showed he was successful and self-assured. David wondered what the man did for work. Maybe he was a lawyer or a doctor. Maybe he owned a business. Whatever he did, it was clear he had done well for himself. David was glad to see successful people flying with his airline. When it was time for economy passengers to board, David walked down the jet bridge and onto the plane. The flight attendants at the door smiled and welcomed everyone aboard. David smiled back and made his way down the aisle. As he passed through first class, he saw the well-dressed man from earlier. The man had taken his seat by the window in row 3. He had already pulled out his laptop and was typing quickly, completely focused on his work. His briefcase sat in the overhead bin. Everything about him showed success and professionalism. David continued to his seat in economy. Seat 24B was a middle seat between 2 other passengers. On his left was an older woman who was already asleep. On his right was a young man with headphones listening to music. David sat down and buckled his seatbelt. The plane slowly filled with passengers. Families found their seats. People stuffed bags into the overhead bins. Flight attendants walked up and down the aisles, helping passengers and checking seatbelts. David looked around carefully. He watched how the flight attendants talked to passengers. He listened to their tone of voice. He wanted to see if they were kind and helpful or rude and impatient. Most of the flight attendants seemed fine. They smiled and answered questions. They helped an old man lift his heavy bag. They brought a blanket for a cold passenger. David felt relieved. Maybe those complaint emails were just from a few angry people. Maybe his airline was doing fine after all. But then he noticed something strange happening in first class. One of the flight attendants, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, was standing next to the well-dressed man David had noticed earlier. Her name tag said Patricia. She looked to be in her 50s with thin lips and sharp eyes. Patricia was talking to the man, but David could not hear what she was saying from his seat. The man looked up from his laptop with a confused expression. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something. It looked like his boarding pass. Patricia took the boarding pass and studied it for a long time. Too long, David thought. Why was she taking so long to look at a simple boarding pass? The man sat patiently, waiting for her to finish. Patricia handed the boarding pass back, but she did not walk away. She stood there looking at the man with an expression that David did not like. It was a look of suspicion and doubt. The man said something to Patricia and turned back to his laptop. He clearly wanted to work. But Patricia did not leave. She continued to stand there, her arms crossed over her chest. David felt a small worry grow in his stomach. Something was not right. He leaned forward in his seat, trying to see better. The older woman next to him woke up and gave him an annoyed look, but David barely noticed. In first class, Patricia was now talking to another flight attendant, a younger woman with red hair. Patricia pointed at the well-dressed man and whispered something. The younger flight attendant looked shocked and shook her head, as if she disagreed. But Patricia's face was firm and determined. David's worry grew bigger. What was happening? Why was Patricia so focused on that passenger? The man had done nothing wrong. He was sitting quietly, working on his laptop, bothering no one. Other passengers started to notice too. A woman across the aisle from the man looked concerned. A businessman in the row behind had stopped reading his newspaper and was watching with interest. Patricia walked back to the well-dressed man. This time David could hear her voice. It was loud and sharp. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again," Patricia said. The man looked up, clearly frustrated now, but he remained calm. He pulled out his boarding pass once more and handed it to Patricia. David unbuckled his seatbelt. He had a bad feeling about where this was going. His instinct told him that he needed to pay close attention. Something was about to happen, and it was not going to be good. Patricia held the boarding pass up to the light, examining it like it was a fake dollar bill. She turned it over and looked at the back. She held it close to her face, then far away. The well-dressed man sat in his seat, watching her with growing confusion. "Is there a problem?" the man asked politely. His voice was deep and calm. "I just need to verify this," Patricia said sharply. "We have to be careful these days." "Careful about what?" the man asked. "That's my boarding pass. My name is on it. My seat number is on it. Everything is correct." Patricia did not answer. She walked away toward the front of the plane, taking the boarding pass with her. The man sat there looking bewildered. He glanced at the other passengers around him, and some of them gave him sympathetic looks. David watched all of this from his economy seat. His hands gripped the armrests. He knew exactly what was happening. He had heard stories like this before. He had read articles about it. But he never thought it would happen on his own airline, right in front of his eyes. The man was being treated with suspicion for no reason, and David knew why. It was because of the color of his skin. Patricia returned a few minutes later. Behind her was a male flight attendant who looked uncomfortable. Patricia handed the boarding pass back to the man. "Sir, we need to sort out a seating issue," Patricia announced loudly. Her voice carried through the entire first-class cabin. Other passengers stopped what they were doing and turned to look. "What seating issue?" the man asked. His voice was still calm, but David could hear tension creeping in. "This is my seat. This is what my boarding pass says." "There must have been a mistake in the system," Patricia insisted. "This seat was assigned to another passenger." "Then show me that passenger," the man said firmly. "Because I checked in yesterday. I selected this exact seat. I paid for first class. This is where I'm supposed to sit." Patricia's face turned red. "Sir, I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being questioned when I've done nothing wrong," the man replied. He was no longer looking at his laptop. He closed it and put it aside. "I've shown you my boarding pass multiple times. What else do you need?" "We need to see additional identification," Patricia demanded. Additional identification? The man repeated, his eyebrows raised. I've never been asked for additional identification after boarding a plane. My boarding pass should be enough. Well, I'm asking now, Patricia said coldly. The man took a deep breath. David could see him trying to control his emotions. Finally, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out his driver's license and handed it to Patricia. Patricia examined the license just as carefully as she had examined the boarding pass. She looked at the photo, then at the man's face, then back at the photo. She did this several times. The name on your license matches your boarding pass, Patricia admitted slowly, as if disappointed. Of course it does, the man said. Because I am who I say I am. But Patricia was not done. How did you pay for this ticket? She asked. The question hung in the air. Several passengers gasped. The uncomfortable male flight attendant behind Patricia looked down at his feet. Excuse me, the man said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it now. I asked how you paid for this ticket. Patricia repeated. First-class tickets are very expensive. I'm just trying to understand. You're trying to understand what? The man interrupted. His calm was starting to crack. You're trying to understand how I can afford to sit here? That's not what I said, Patricia backtracked quickly. But that's what you meant, the man said. He stood up now, and David could see he was even taller than he had first appeared. Let me be very clear. I paid for this ticket with my own money. Money that I earned through my own hard work. I have flown on hundreds of flights. I have never, ever been treated like this. Sir, if you don't calm down, I'll have to call security, Patricia threatened. I am calm, the man said, his voice rising slightly. I've been calm this entire time while you've harassed me. I've answered every question you've asked. I've shown you everything you've demanded to see. What more do you want from me? Other passengers started speaking up. Leave him alone, a woman in row 2 called out. He hasn't done anything wrong. This is ridiculous, a businessman agreed. The man clearly belongs in first class. Patricia spun around to face them. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. I'm responsible for everyone's safety, and I will not be told how to do my job. Safety? The well-dressed man said bitterly. What does safety have to do with checking my boarding pass 5 times and asking how I paid for my ticket? Patricia turned back to him, her eyes cold. Sir, I'm asking you one final time to cooperate, or I will have you removed from this flight. Removed for what? The man demanded. For sitting in the seat I paid for being black? The word hung in the air. Patricia's face went pale, then red again. How dare you accuse me of that? Patricia hissed. I treat all passengers equally. That's clearly not true, the woman in row 2 said. She had taken out her phone and was recording. I've been watching this whole thing. You've been harassing this man since he sat down. Put that phone away, Patricia snapped. I don't think so, the woman replied. People need to see this. Patricia's hand went to the phone on the wall, the one used to call the cockpit. I'm calling the captain and security. The well-dressed man sat back down heavily in his seat. He looked tired now. The fight seemed to drain out of him. David recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had been through this before. Someone who knew that no matter what he said or did, he would be seen as the problem. David had seen enough. His heart was pounding. His face felt hot with anger and shame. This was his airline. These were his employees. This was happening under his name, under his brand. He stood up from his middle seat in economy. The older woman next to him woke up again and made an annoyed sound. The young man with headphones looked up, confused. But David barely noticed them. He started walking toward first class. His legs felt shaky, but his resolve was firm. He could hear Patricia's voice getting louder as she spoke on the phone. Yes, we need security at gate 17. We have a passenger causing a disturbance. He's refusing to cooperate. He's being verbally aggressive. That's a lie, someone shouted. He's been completely calm. David reached the curtain that separated economy from first class. He pushed it aside and stepped through. Several flight attendants were now gathered in the galley, whispering to each other. They looked at David curiously. In his jeans and baseball cap, he looked like he should not be in first class. One of them, a young man with neat brown hair, stepped forward. "Sir, you need to return to your seat. This area is for first-class passengers only." "I know," David said quietly. His heart was racing. "But I need to speak with Patricia." "Patricia is handling a situation right now," the young man said firmly. "Please go back to your seat." David took off his baseball cap. He ran his hand through his hair. Then he looked the young man directly in the eyes. "My name is David Chen," he said clearly. "I'm the CEO of Skyline Airways, and I need to speak with Patricia right now." The young man's face went completely white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other flight attendants in the galley froze. One of them dropped the cup she was holding. It clattered on the floor and coffee spilled everywhere, but no one moved to clean it up. Patricia was still on the phone, her back to David. She had not heard him introduce himself. "And make sure security knows this passenger has been hostile," Patricia was saying into the phone. "We may need to have him arrested when we land. People like this need to learn that they can't just—" "Patricia," David said loudly. Patricia turned around. When she saw David standing there with all the other flight attendants looking shocked, confusion crossed her face. "Can I help you?" she asked impatiently. "You need to return to economy. This really isn't the time for—" "Patricia," David repeated. "I'm David Chen. I'm the CEO of this airline." For a long moment, Patricia just stared at him. She looked at his jeans, his sweater, his sneakers. She looked at his face. Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes. The phone slipped from her hand and dangled from its cord. Before David could speak again, Patricia's face changed. The shock disappeared and was replaced with something else, anger, defense. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. "Mr. Chen," Patricia said, her voice tight, "I didn't expect to see you on this flight, but I'm glad you're here. You can see for yourself that I was just doing my job." David felt his jaw tighten. "Your job?" he repeated slowly. "Yes," Patricia said firmly. "That passenger has been difficult since he boarded. I asked to see his boarding pass and he became aggressive and confrontational." "That's not true," the woman in row 2 shouted. She was still recording on her phone. "You've been harassing him this whole time." Patricia shot the woman an angry look. "Ma'am, please put that phone away. Recording crew members without permission is against airline policy." "Actually, it's not," David said quietly. He knew his company's policies by heart. Passengers are allowed to record as long as they don't interfere with safety or crew members doing their jobs. "And she's right to record this." Patricia's face flushed red. "Sir, with all due respect, I was handling a security situation." "This passenger has done absolutely nothing wrong," David finished. He walked past Patricia and approached the well-dressed man, who was still sitting in his seat. The man looked up at David with tired, wary eyes. "I'm very sorry about this," David said to him. "My name is David Chen. I'm the CEO of Skyline Airways." The man studied David's face for a moment. Then he gave a sad, bitter laugh. "Of course you are. Of course the CEO happens to be on this exact flight." He shook his head. "I can't decide if that makes this better or worse." "I know my apology doesn't fix what just happened," David said. "But I want you to know that this is not acceptable. This is not how my airline should treat anyone." Behind David, Patricia made a sound of protest. "Mr. Chen, I really think you're not seeing the full picture here. When I first approached this passenger, he was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" The well-dressed man cut her off. His voice was sharp now. "I was sitting in my seat working on my laptop. How is that suspicious?" "You seemed nervous," Patricia insisted. "I wasn't nervous until you started questioning me." The man shot back. He stood up again, and David could see his hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with anger and frustration. "Do you know how many flights I've taken in my life? Hundreds, maybe thousands. And do you know how many times I've been treated like a criminal just for sitting in my seat? More times than I can count." "Now that's not fair," Patricia started. "Not fair?" The man's voice rose. "What's not fair is being judged by the color of my skin. What's not fair is being questioned over and over when I've shown you everything you asked for. What's not fair is being threatened with security when I haven't done a single thing wrong." Other passengers started talking loudly, agreeing with him. The whole first-class cabin was now watching this scene unfold. Several people had their phones out recording. Patricia's voice got louder too. "I was simply following protocol." When a passenger seems out of place, out of place? The man repeated. Out of place? You mean black? I never said that. Patricia's face was bright red now. You're putting words in my mouth. I would have done the same thing regardless of what? The woman in row 2 interrupted. I've been flying for 30 years and I've never once been asked to show additional ID after boarding. I've never been asked how I paid for my ticket. And you want to know why? Because I'm white. A businessman in row 4 spoke up. She's right. I fly first class all the time. No one has ever questioned whether I belong here. Patricia spun around to face all of them. You people don't understand. I have to ensure the safety of this aircraft. I have to make sure of what? David asked. His voice was calm but cold. That only certain people are allowed in first class? That only certain people can afford expensive tickets? That's not what I meant. Patricia protested. Then what did you mean? David pressed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you singled out this passenger for no reason except the way he looks. The well-dressed man laughed again, but there was no humor in it. You want to know the worst part? He said to David, this isn't even surprising. I built a company worth billions of dollars. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I've been on magazine covers. I've given speeches at universities. And none of that matters when I try to sit in first class on an airplane. You're a billionaire? Patricia's eyes went wide. The color drained from her face. Does that matter? The man asked. Should it matter? Would it have been okay to treat me this way if I wasn't rich? If I was just a regular person who saved up for a first-class ticket? Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around at all the passengers staring at her. She looked at the cameras recording her. She looked at David, whose expression was hard and disappointed. I was just trying to do my job, Patricia said weakly. No, David said firmly. You were profiling a passenger. You made assumptions based on his appearance, and then when he rightfully objected, you threatened him with security. He was being difficult. He was being human. David's voice rose now. He rarely got angry, but this situation was bringing out emotions he usually kept controlled. He was responding the way any person would when they're being treated unfairly. And instead of apologizing, you doubled down. You called him difficult. You called him aggressive. You tried to make him the problem. The younger male flight attendant who had been standing behind Patricia earlier now spoke up. His voice was quiet but firm. Mr. Chen, I want to say something. Patricia asked me to support her earlier. She said the passenger seemed suspicious and that we should question him, but I didn't see anything suspicious. He was just sitting there. I told her that, but she insisted. Patricia turned on him. You're throwing me under the bus? I'm telling the truth, the young man replied. I'm not going to lie to protect you. Another flight attendant, a woman with dark hair, stepped forward. I saw it too. The passenger was doing nothing wrong. Patricia approached him and immediately started asking questions. It was uncomfortable to watch. Patricia looked around wildly. You're all against me. All of you. We're not against you, David said. We're against what you did. There's a difference. The well-dressed man sat back down in his seat. He suddenly looked very tired. Can I just ask, he said quietly, why me? There are other black passengers on this plane. I saw at least 3 others boarding. Why did you pick me? Patricia didn't answer. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I'll tell you why, the man continued. Because I was in first class. Because you couldn't understand how a black man could afford to be here. You saw me. You made an assumption and you decided I didn't belong. I have black friends, Patricia said suddenly. I'm not racist. I really thought there was a problem with your ticket, several passengers groaned. The woman in row 2 shook her head. That's what they all say, she muttered. David closed his eyes for a moment. He felt ashamed and angry. This was his company. This was happening under his watch. He had built Skyline Airways to be better than this. But clearly he had failed. Patricia, David said, opening his eyes. You're suspended. Effective immediately. You need to leave this aircraft. Patricia's eyes went wide. What? You can't do that? I've worked for this airline for 18 years. I have seniority. I have rights. And this passenger has rights too, David replied. The right to be treated with dignity and respect. The right to sit in the seat he paid for without being harassed. You're going to fire me because I was doing my job? Patricia's voice was getting shrill now. You weren't doing your job, David said firmly. You were profiling a passenger. And that is unacceptable. Patricia's face crumpled. Tears started running down her cheeks. Please, she said. Please don't do this. I have a mortgage. I have bills. I need this job. David felt a small pang of sympathy, but he pushed it down. You should have thought about that before you treated a passenger this way. Patricia looked around at all the faces watching her. She looked at her fellow flight attendants, but none of them met her eyes. Finally, she grabbed her bag from the galley and pushed past David. As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, passengers watched her go. Some looked satisfied. Others looked uncomfortable. The well-dressed man just looked sad. When Patricia reached the door of the aircraft, she turned back one more time. You'll regret this, she said to David. I'll sue. I'll go to the news. I'll tell everyone how you treated me. Go ahead, David said calmly. But I think the news will be more interested in the videos of how you treated this passenger. Patricia's face went pale. She looked at all the phones that were still recording. Then, without another word, she left the plane. After Patricia left the plane, the cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Passengers looked at each other, not sure what to say. The remaining flight attendants stood in the galley, whispering nervously. David could hear some of them crying softly. He turned back to the well-dressed man who was staring out the window. The man's jaw was tight and his hands were clasped together in his lap. Sir, David said gently, I know I've already apologized, but I want to say it again. What happened to you was wrong. It was discriminatory and humiliating, and it never should have happened. The man didn't turn from the window. Do you know what the sad part is? He said quietly. I'm not even surprised. I'm angry, yes. I'm hurt, but I'm not surprised. David felt those words like a punch to his gut. May I sit down? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat next to the man. The man finally turned to look at David. He studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether David was sincere or just trying to avoid a lawsuit. Finally, he nodded. David sat down in the plush first-class seat. It was much more comfortable than his middle seat back in economy. He thought about how he had been excited to sit back there, to see how regular passengers were treated. Now he realized that he had witnessed something far more important and far more disturbing. I'm David Chen, he said, offering his hand. The man looked at David's hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm and professional. I know who you are, he said. You mentioned it several times, and your face is on the wall in the airport terminal. Our CEO's commitment to excellence, or something like that. David winced. I'm guessing that commitment feels pretty empty right now. You could say that, the man replied. He finally released David's hand and looked back out the window. You want to know something funny? I was actually considering investing in your airline. David's eyes widened. You're an investor? Among other things, the man said with a slight smile. I started a technology company about 15 years ago. Built it from nothing. We make software for businesses. Last year, we were valued at $3.7 billion. David felt his stomach sink even further. This wasn't just any passenger. This was someone with real power and influence. Someone who could cause serious problems for Skyline Airways if he wanted to. But more than that, David realized this was someone who had achieved incredible success, and it hadn't protected him from being treated like a criminal. What's your name? David asked. If you don't mind me asking. The man hesitated, then said, I prefer not to say right now. Not while everyone is recording and watching. The last thing I need is my name attached to another viral video about discrimination. I've been there before and it's exhausting. Another video? David asked. This has happened to you before? The man laughed, but it was a sad sound. More times than I can count. Different airlines, same story. Sometimes it's the flight attendants. Sometimes it's other passengers who complain that I'm in first class. Once, a gate agent insisted my ticket must be fake because people like you don't usually fly first class. People like you, David repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Meaning black people. Bingo, the man said. And before you say it's just a few bad apples or that most people aren't like this, let me stop you. I know most people aren't actively racist, but the problem is that enough of them are. And the ones who aren't often don't speak up when they see it happening. David thought about the passengers who had defended the man. They had spoken up, at least. But he wondered how many other incidents like this happened when he wasn't there to see it. How many times did his flight attendants profile passengers and no one in authority was there to stop it? You said you were thinking about investing in my airline, David said. Can I ask why? The man shrugged. I fly a lot for business. I've tried all the major airlines. Skyline Airways has always been decent. Good service, comfortable planes, reasonable prices. I thought it might be a smart investment. He paused. Past tense now, obviously. I understand, David said. But can I ask you something? What would it take for you to reconsider? The man turned to look at David fully now. His eyes were intelligent and sharp. Are you seriously trying to save a business deal right now? After what just happened? No, David said quickly. That's not what I meant. I'm asking because I want to know what would make this right. Not just for you, but for everyone. I want to know what real change looks like. The man studied David's face again. Most CEOs would just offer me money. Upgrade me to some premium status. Give me free flights. Make the problem go away. Is that what you want? David asked. No, the man said firmly. Money doesn't fix racism. Perks don't fix discrimination. What I want is for this to never happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. Tell me how to do that, David said. I'm serious. I want to fix this, the man leaned back in his seat. He looked tired, like this conversation was draining what little energy he had left. You want to fix it? Really fix it? Yes. Then you need to do more than fire one flight attendant, the man said. You need to look at your whole company. You need to ask yourself why Patricia thought it was okay to treat me that way. You need to ask if other employees have done the same thing. You need to look at your training programs, your policies, your culture. David pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. Keep talking. I'm listening. The man raised an eyebrow. You're actually taking notes. I told you I'm serious, David replied. The man watched David for another moment, then continued. First, you need mandatory bias training for all employees. Not the fake stuff where everyone sits through a boring video and signs a paper. Real training. Bring in experts. Make it interactive. Make people understand that discrimination isn't just about using slurs or being openly hateful. It's about assumptions and stereotypes and the 1,000 small ways that people of color get treated differently. David typed quickly. Okay, what else? Second, you need clear consequences. Patricia shouldn't be the only one held accountable. Any employee who discriminates should face serious penalties. And you need to make sure everyone knows about those consequences. Done, David said. What else? Third, you need a way for passengers to report discrimination easily. Not through some complicated system where they have to fill out forms and wait weeks for a response. An immediate hotline, text, phone, whatever, and someone needs to respond quickly. David nodded, still typing. Good, keep going. The man seemed to warm up a bit. Fourth, you need diversity in leadership. Look around your company. Who makes the decisions? Who creates the policies? If it's all people who look like you and me, you're missing perspectives. You need Black people, Latino people, Asian people, women, LGBTQ people, people who have experienced discrimination and can help prevent it. I can work on that, David said. My executive team is mostly white and Asian men. You're right. Fifth, the man continued, you need to look at your data. Track complaints. Track incidents. See if there are patterns. Are certain routes worse than others? Are certain crews more likely to have problems? Use data to find the problems before they blow up. David looked up from his phone. This is really good advice. Have you done this kind of work before? I had to, the man said. My own company had diversity problems when we started growing. I thought hiring the best people would be enough. But I learned that best people often really means people like us. I had to completely change how we recruited, how we trained, how we thought about talent. And did it work? David asked. We're better now, the man said. Not perfect. We still mess up sometimes, but we're trying, and we're learning. That's all anyone can ask. David saved his notes and put his phone away. Thank you for this. Seriously, you didn't have to help me. I'm not doing it for you, the man said honestly. I'm doing it for the next Black person who flies on your airline. And the one after that, and the thousands after that. They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, passengers were still watching, though some had gone back to their phones or books. The flight attendants were preparing for takeoff, checking overhead bins and making sure everyone was buckled in. There's something else I want to do, David said suddenly. Something more immediate. What's that? The man asked. David stood up. He walked to the front of the plane, where the intercom system was located. One of the flight attendants, the young man who had spoken up earlier, saw him coming. Mr. Chen, is everything okay? The young man asked nervously. "What's your name?" David asked. "James, sir." "James, I need to use the intercom. Is that okay?" James nodded and handed David the phone. David pressed the button that would let his voice reach every passenger on the plane, from first class all the way to the back row of economy. "Good morning, everyone," David said, his voice echoing through the cabin. "My name is David Chen, and I'm the CEO of Skyline Airways." Passengers looked up in surprise. The people in economy craned their necks trying to see who was speaking. "I'm on this flight today because I wanted to see how we treat our customers," David continued. "And what I saw in first class a few minutes ago was unacceptable." The cabin was completely silent now. Everyone was listening. One of our passengers was discriminated against by a member of our crew. He was questioned repeatedly, treated with suspicion, and threatened with removal from the flight. The plane finally took off about 30 minutes late. The delay was because Patricia had to be replaced and a new senior flight attendant had to be called in. But eventually, they were in the air, climbing above the clouds over New York City. David stayed in first class, sitting next to the well-dressed man. The other passengers had settled down now, though people still kept glancing over at them. Some were probably hoping to see more drama. Others seemed genuinely interested in what would happen next. "Can I buy you a drink?" David asked once they reached cruising altitude. "It's the least I can do," the man laughed softly. "You own the airline. You don't need to buy me anything. It's all free for you anyway." "Good point," David admitted. He signaled to James, the young flight attendant. "Can we get 2 drinks, please, whatever this gentleman would like?" "Whiskey," the man said. "Neat. The good stuff if you have it." "And I'll have the same," David added. James brought them their drinks a few minutes later. His hands shook slightly as he set down the glasses. He was clearly still nervous about everything that had happened. "James," David said gently. "Thank you for speaking up earlier. That took courage." James looked surprised. "I just told the truth, sir. A lot of people don't," the man next to David said. "Even when they know something is wrong, they stay quiet. You didn't. That matters." James's face flushed with pride. "Thank you, sir. Both of you." He hurried away before he could get emotional. David picked up his glass and took a sip. The whiskey was smooth and expensive. He usually didn't drink during the day, but today felt like an exception. "So," David said, "you've told me about your company. You've told me about discrimination in the airline industry, but you haven't told me your name." The man swirled his whiskey, watching the amber liquid move in the glass. "If I tell you my name, you'll probably recognize it. And then, this whole conversation will change." "Why would it change?" David asked. "Because people always act different when they know you're rich," the man said. "They get nervous. They start calculating. They wonder what they can get from you. I'd rather just talk as 2 people, not as CEO and potential investor." "That's fair," David said. "But can I ask you something? Why were you considering investing in Skyline Airways anyway? You said you fly a lot, but there are plenty of airlines. What made you interested in us?" The man set down his glass. "Honestly, I liked your story. You started this airline 15 years ago with 3 planes and a dream. Everyone said you would fail. The big airlines would crush you, but you didn't fail. You found your niche. You treated customers well. You paid your employees fairly. You grew slowly but steadily." "You've done your research," David observed. "Of course I did," the man said. "I don't invest money without research. But more than that, I like that you seem to actually care. Most airline CEOs just care about profits. But you talked about creating a better flying experience. You talked about treating people with dignity." David felt a knot in his stomach. "And then today happened." "Yeah," the man said. "Today happened." They sat in silence for a moment. David took another sip of his whiskey. He thought about all the decisions he had made over the years. He had worked so hard to build Skyline Airways into something he could be proud of. But clearly, he had missed something important. "Can I tell you something?" David said. "Something I'm not proud of?" The man turned to look at him. "Go ahead." "When I started this airline, I told myself I would be different," David said. "I would create a company where everyone was treated fairly, where diversity mattered. where discrimination would never be tolerated. But somewhere along the way, I got caught up in growth and profits and expansion. I stopped paying attention to the details. I stopped seeing the problems. "You're human," the man said with a shrug. "That's not an excuse," David replied. "I'm the CEO. This is my company. If there's discrimination happening, it's my responsibility to stop it." The man nodded slowly. "You're right. It is your responsibility. But at least you're acknowledging it now. Most people would make excuses. They'd say it was one bad employee. They'd say they had no idea. They'd do damage control and move on." "Is that what you expected me to do?" David asked. "I don't know what I expected," the man admitted. "I've been through situations like this before. Usually someone from the company calls me later. They apologize. They offer compensation. They promise it won't happen again. But it always does happen again. Because nothing really changes." David pulled out his phone again. "So let's change it. You gave me good advice earlier, but I want to know more. I want to know everything." The man raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" "Everything," David confirmed. "Tell me about every time you've experienced discrimination while traveling. Tell me what airlines did wrong and what they could have done better. Tell me what real change looks like." The man leaned back in his seat. He looked at David for a long moment, as if deciding whether David was serious or just making empty promises. Finally, he started talking. "The first time it happened, I was in my 20s, the man said. I had just started my company. We had landed a big contract, and I was flying to San Francisco to meet with the client. I booked a first-class ticket because I wanted to arrive fresh and ready to impress. But when I got to my seat, a white woman was sitting there." "What happened?" David asked. "I showed her my boarding pass. She looked at it, looked at me, and said there must be a mistake. She called the flight attendant. The flight attendant looked at my ticket and then asked if I was sure I had booked first class. I said yes. She asked how I paid for it. I told her with my credit card. She asked to see the card." David winced. "That's exactly what Patricia did today." "I know," the man said. "That's why I wasn't surprised. I've seen this script before." "Did they let you sit in your seat?" David asked. "Eventually," the man said. "After they verified everything 3 times. After they made me feel like a criminal. After every other passenger in first class stared at me like I didn't belong. I sat there for 6 hours and no one said a word to me. The flight attendants barely made eye contact." "I'm sorry," David said. The man waved his hand. "That was 20 years ago. I've got plenty more stories if you want to hear them." "I do," David said. "Keep going." Over the next hour, the man told David story after story. There was the time a gate agent insisted his passport must be fake because you don't look like a business traveler. There was the time a fellow passenger reported him as suspicious because he was reading in Arabic, even though the book was actually about learning Arabic for business. There was the time he was seated next to a family, and the father demanded to be moved because he didn't feel comfortable. With each story, David felt worse. He thought about how many times this man had been humiliated, questioned, and treated like a threat. And he thought about how many other black passengers had similar stories. "The thing that bothers me most," the man said, "is that I'm lucky." "Lucky?" David repeated. "How are you lucky?" "I'm rich," the man said simply. "I can afford first class. I can afford to complain. I have lawyers. I have power. Most black people who experience this kind of discrimination can't fight back. They can't afford to make a fuss. They just have to take it and move on." David thought about that. The man was right. If Patricia had discriminated against someone who wasn't wealthy and powerful, would David have even known about it? Would anyone have cared? "That's why this has to change," David said firmly. "Not just for you, but for everyone. Every person who flies on my airline should feel safe and respected, regardless of who they are or how much money they have." The man smiled again. It was a sad smile, but there was hope in it too. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," David said. "And I'm going to prove it." The man picked up his whiskey glass and held it up. "Then I propose a toast to change. Real change, not just words. David clinked his glass against the man's. To change. They both drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it felt appropriate. This whole day had been painful, but maybe something good could come from it. Okay, the man said, setting down his empty glass. You want to know who I am? You want to know my name? Only if you want to tell me, David said. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a business card and handed it to David. David looked at the card. His eyes widened. The man was Jonathan Rivers, founder and CEO of RiverTech Solutions. David had heard of RiverTech. Everyone in business had heard of RiverTech. They made enterprise software that half of Fortune 500 companies used. The company was worth billions. Jonathan Rivers himself was worth nearly $4 billion, and David had just watched him get treated like a criminal on his own airline. Oh my God, David breathed. Yeah, Jonathan said. Now you know why I prefer to stay anonymous sometimes. I've read about you, David said, still staring at the business card. You're one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. You've been on the cover of Forbes. You give speeches at conferences. And none of that mattered to Patricia, Jonathan said quietly, because all she saw was a black man sitting in first class. David felt like he might be sick. This wasn't just any passenger. This was someone who could seriously damage his airline's reputation, someone who could tell this story to millions of people. But more than that, this was someone who had achieved incredible things and still couldn't escape racism. I know what you're thinking, Jonathan said. You're thinking about the PR disaster. You're thinking about the lawsuits. You're thinking about the damage to your company. No, David said honestly. I mean, yes, I'm thinking about those things. But mostly I'm thinking about how wrong this is. How fundamentally, deeply wrong. Jonathan studied David's face. You know what? I believe you. I'm glad, David said. Because I'm going to need your help. My help? Jonathan looked surprised. You said you were considering investing in my airline, David said. What if I told you I don't want your money? What if I told you I want something more valuable? What's that? Jonathan asked. Your expertise, David said. Your experience. Your perspective. I want you to help me rebuild this company from the ground up. I want you to help me create an airline that actually lives up to its values. Jonathan sat back in his seat. He looked at David with those sharp, intelligent eyes. You're serious? Completely serious, David said. I can't fix this alone. I'm a Chinese-American man who grew up middle class. I've experienced some discrimination, sure, but nothing like what you've been through. I need people like you to tell me what I'm missing. To tell me what real change looks like. And what would this look like? Jonathan asked. Me helping you? I don't know exactly, David admitted. Maybe you could join our board of directors. Maybe you could be an advisor. Maybe we could create a partnership between our companies. I'm open to ideas. Jonathan was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the clouds below. David waited, not wanting to push. Finally, Jonathan turned back to David. Okay, he said. I'll help you, but I have conditions. Name them, David said. First, this isn't just about making your airline look good, Jonathan said. This is about real, meaningful change. If at any point I think you're just doing this for PR, I'm out. Agreed, David said. Second, you have to be willing to do uncomfortable things, Jonathan continued. You have to be willing to fire people who discriminate. You have to be willing to change policies even if they're expensive. You have to be willing to admit when you're wrong. I can do that, David promised. Third, Jonathan said, this isn't just about black passengers. Discrimination comes in all forms. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Discrimination against disabled people. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Absolutely, David agreed. Jonathan held out his hand. Then you've got a deal. David shook his hand firmly. Around them, a few passengers who had been listening applauded softly. James, the flight attendant, was wiping tears from his eyes. There's one more thing, Jonathan said as they released hands. What's that? I still want to invest in your airline, Jonathan said with a grin. If we're going to turn this company around, I want to be part of it financially too. David couldn't help but laugh. After everything that had happened today, they were ending up as business partners. Sometimes, he thought, the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes. The plane was about 2 hours from Los Angeles when David decided it was time to make more announcements. He had been thinking about everything Jonathan had told him. He had been making notes on his phone, and he had been feeling more and more determined to make real changes. "I need to use the intercom again," David said to Jonathan. "Is that okay with you?" Jonathan looked at him curiously. "What are you going to say?" "You'll see," David said. He stood up and walked to the front of the plane again. James handed him the phone without being asked. David pressed the button and took a deep breath. "Hello again, everyone." David's voice echoed through the cabin. "This is David Chen, CEO of Skyline Airways. I spoke to you earlier about the discrimination that happened on this flight, but I don't want to just apologize. I want to tell you what we're going to do about it." Passengers put down their books and phones. Even the people who had been sleeping woke up and paid attention. "Starting today, Skyline Airways is implementing several new policies," David continued. "First, every single employee will go through comprehensive training on bias and discrimination. This won't be a boring video that people ignore. This will be real, meaningful training led by experts. Every flight attendant, every gate agent, every person who works for this company will learn how to recognize their own biases and how to treat all passengers with equal respect." There was a murmur of approval from the passengers. "Second," David said, "we're creating a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Any employee who discriminates against a passenger based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or any other factor will be immediately suspended and investigated. If the investigation confirms discrimination, that employee will be terminated. No exceptions. No second chances." More applause. Some people cheered. "Third," David continued, "we're creating a passenger advocacy hotline. If you ever experience or witness discrimination on one of our flights, you can call or text this number immediately. A real person will respond within minutes, not days or weeks. We'll take your complaint seriously and we'll take action." David paused to let that sink in. "Fourth, we're forming a diversity and inclusion advisory board. This board will include passengers, employees, and outside experts. They'll help us identify problems and create solutions. They'll hold us accountable. And yes, before anyone asks, the passenger who was discriminated against today has agreed to be part of this board." Jonathan gave David a small wave from his seat. Some passengers turned to look at him and a few started clapping. "Fifth and finally," David said, "I'm committing to making our leadership team more diverse. Right now, most of my executives look like me. That needs to change. We need different perspectives. We need people who have experienced discrimination and can help us prevent it." David looked around at all the faces watching him. Some people looked hopeful. Some looked skeptical. He understood both reactions. "I know some of you are thinking this is just talk," David said. "You're thinking I'll make these promises today and forget about them tomorrow. I understand that doubt, but I'm going to prove you wrong. In 1 month, I want every person on this flight to receive an email from me personally. That email will detail exactly what we've done to implement these policies. You'll see the training we've created. You'll see the hotline number. You'll see the members of our advisory board. And if we haven't done what we promised, you can call us out." He looked directly at the woman in row 2 who had been recording. "In fact, I encourage you all to post your videos online. Share what happened today. Hold us accountable. Make sure we follow through." The woman smiled and gave him a thumbs up. "One more thing," David added. "To the passenger who was discriminated against today," he turned to look at Jonathan, "I'd like to offer you a lifetime platinum membership with Skyline Airways. You'll have priority boarding, free upgrades, and access to all of our lounges. But more than that, I'd like to offer you a seat on our next international flight in our private suite, with our sincerest apologies." The cabin erupted in loud applause. People stood up clapping and cheering. Even the flight attendants were clapping. David hung up the phone and walked back to his seat. His heart was pounding. He had just made huge promises in front of hundreds of witnesses. Now he had to actually follow through. "That was quite a speech," Jonathan said as David sat down. "Too much?" David asked. "No," Jonathan said thoughtfully. "It was good. But you know you just committed to a lot of work, right? This isn't going to be easy." "I know," David said. "But it's necessary." James came by with more drinks. "Mr. Chen, can I say something?" "Of course," David replied. "I've worked for this airline for 3 years," James said. "And I've always been proud to work here. But after today, I'm even more proud. What you're doing, it matters. Not just for passengers, but for employees too. Some of us have tried to speak up about problems before, but we were told to be quiet. It feels good to know that might actually change. What kind of problems? David asked, leaning forward. James glanced around nervously. Maybe we could talk about this later. When there aren't so many people listening? No, David said firmly. I want to hear this now. Everyone should hear this. If there are problems in my company, I want them out in the open. James took a deep breath. Okay, well, there's favoritism. Some flight attendants treat certain passengers better than others. Usually it's based on how people look or dress. Rich-looking people get great service. People who look poor or different get ignored or treated rudely. Give me an example, David said. Last month, I worked a flight where a Latino family was speaking Spanish to each other, James said. One of the senior flight attendants, not Patricia, someone else, started speaking to them very slowly and loudly, like they were stupid. She kept saying, "Do you understand?" even though they spoke perfect English. The family was so embarrassed. David felt anger rising in his chest again. What happened? Did anyone report it? I tried, James admitted. I filled out a complaint form, but nothing happened. The senior flight attendant said she was just trying to help. She said I was being too sensitive. Who was the supervisor who dismissed your complaint? David asked. James looked uncomfortable. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. James, David said gently, people need to be held accountable. If supervisors are ignoring complaints about discrimination, I need to know who they are. James nodded slowly. It was Tom Davidson. He's the crew supervisor for the East Coast routes. David made a note in his phone. Thank you for telling me. I promise I'll look into this. There's more, James said. We also have problems with how we treat disabled passengers. Sometimes flight attendants complain when they have to help people with wheelchairs or mobility issues. They act like it's a huge burden. I've heard them make rude comments after the passengers can't hear them. That's unacceptable, David said firmly. And there's the way some crew members talk about Muslim passengers, James continued. He was speaking faster now, like he had been holding all of this in for a long time. They profile them. They watch them extra carefully. They report suspicious behavior that isn't suspicious at all. Just people praying or speaking Arabic or wearing religious clothing. David's hands were shaking as he typed notes. He had no idea his airline had these problems. How had he missed all of this? Jonathan leaned forward. James, can I ask you something? Why did you keep working here if you saw all these problems? James thought about it. Because most of the crew is good. Most of us want to do the right thing. And I kept hoping things would change. Plus, I need this job. I have student loans and rent to pay. You shouldn't have to choose between your job and your values, Jonathan said. I know, James agreed. But that's reality for a lot of us. David looked up from his phone. Not anymore. James, I want to hire you as a consultant. James blinked in surprise. What? You clearly see problems that I don't see, David said. You understand what's happening on the ground level. I need people like you to help fix this company. Would you be willing to work with me and Jonathan on the advisory board? I'm just a flight attendant, James said. I don't have experience with that kind of thing. That's exactly why we need you, Jonathan said. We don't need more executives who've never dealt with real passengers. We need people who are in the trenches every day. James's eyes filled with tears. Yes, I would love to help. Good, David said. He held out his hand and James shook it. Over the next hour, more flight attendants came to talk to David. They shared stories about discrimination, about complaints that were ignored, about passengers who were treated unfairly. David listened to every single story and took notes on everything. A flight attendant named Maria told him about a transgender passenger who was repeatedly misgendered by crew members, even after politely correcting them. A flight attendant named Robert talked about how disabled passengers were often treated like they were stupid or incapable. A flight attendant named Lisa described how passengers in hijabs were subjected to extra security checks and suspicious glares. With each story, David felt worse. His airline had serious problems. Problems he had been completely unaware of because he was too far removed from the day-to-day operations. But he also felt something else. He felt grateful that his employees were finally comfortable speaking up. He felt hopeful that things could actually change. Several passengers also came to talk to David. The woman in row 2, whose name was Angela, showed him the videos she had recorded. I'm going to post these, she said. But I want you to know I'm not doing it to hurt your company. I'm doing it because people need to see what happens. I understand, David said. Please post them. We need accountability. A black woman from economy came up to first class. I just want to say thank you, she said to David. I've been discriminated against on flights before. No one ever stood up for me. It means a lot that you're taking this seriously. I'm sorry you've had those experiences, David said. We're going to do better, she smiled. I'm going to hold you to that promise. Then she turned to Jonathan. And thank you for speaking up. I know it's exhausting to have to fight against this stuff all the time. Jonathan stood and gave her a hug. We're in this together. By the time the plane started its descent into Los Angeles, David had filled dozens of pages in his notes app. He had stories, names, specific incidents, and ideas for solutions. But more than that, he had a community, passengers and crew members who wanted to help make things better. People who believed change was possible. As the plane touched down on the runway, David looked at Jonathan. Ready to change the world? Jonathan smiled. Let's start with changing one airline. Then we'll see about the world. The plane taxied to the gate. Passengers started gathering their belongings. But before anyone could leave, David picked up the intercom one last time. Thank you all for flying with Skyline Airways today, he said. This was not the flight any of us expected. But I believe something important happened here. We witnessed discrimination and we didn't stay silent. We spoke up. We demanded better, and together, we're going to create change. He paused, then added, Safe travels, everyone, and thank you for holding us accountable. As passengers filed off the plane, many of them stopped to shake David's hand or thank him. Some gave him their business cards and offered to help with the changes he had promised. Jonathan was one of the last to leave. As he picked up his briefcase, he turned to David. You know this is just the beginning, right? The hard part comes next. I know, David said, but I'm ready. Good, Jonathan said, because I'm going to hold you to every promise you made today. I wouldn't expect anything less, David replied. They shook hands one more time. Then Jonathan walked off the plane, leaving David standing there with James and the other flight attendants. What happens now? James asked. David looked at all of them. Now we get to work. David was still in the Los Angeles airport when his phone started buzzing. Text messages, email notifications, phone calls, all at once like a wave crashing over him. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. Dozens of notifications, then hundreds. His assistant was calling. His PR director was calling. Even his wife was calling. He answered his wife first. David, what's going on? She asked immediately. Your face is all over Twitter. Twitter? David repeated. He opened the app and saw that he was trending. Videos from the flight were everywhere. Biker. Skyline Airways was the #1 trend in the United States. I'll explain everything later, David promised. But I need to handle this first. I love you. I love you too, his wife said. And David, whatever you did, I'm proud of you. You look like a hero in these videos. David hung up and started scrolling through Twitter. Angela, the woman from row 2, had posted her videos. They had already been viewed millions of times. Other passengers had posted their videos too. David saw himself on the intercom, making promises to change the airline. He saw Patricia confronting Jonathan. He saw the moment he revealed himself as CEO. The comments were intense. Some people were praising David for standing up to discrimination. Others were criticizing him for letting it happen in the first place. Some people thought the whole thing was staged. Others were sharing their own stories of discrimination on flights. His PR director finally got through. David, we need to put out a statement right away. The news media is calling. Everyone wants an interview. No statement, David said firmly. What? His PR director sounded panicked. David, we need to control this narrative. There's no narrative to control, David replied. Everything that happened on that flight is true. I'm not going to spin it or hide it. People can watch the videos and see for themselves. But we need to protect the company's reputation. His PR director insisted. The company's reputation should be based on what we actually do, not what we say, David said. We messed up. A passenger was discriminated against. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He hung up before his PR director could argue more. Then he called his assistant. Clear my schedule for the next week, David instructed. Cancel everything. I have work to do. David, you have a meeting with investors tomorrow, his assistant protested. and a conference call with the board on Wednesday. Cancel them, David repeated. This is more important. He spent the next several hours in the airport working on his laptop. He started drafting new policies. He researched companies that did diversity training. He looked up experts on discrimination and bias. He made lists of things that needed to change. Jonathan texted him around 6 that evening. Have you seen the news? David opened his news app. The incident on Flight 447 was the top story on every major news site. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, The New York Times, The Washington Post. Everyone was covering it. Airline CEO confronts discrimination on his own flight. Black billionaire speaks out after being profiled on Skyline Airways. Viral video shows CEO taking immediate action against racist flight attendant. David clicked on a CNN article. It included interviews with passengers from the flight. Angela, the woman who had recorded the videos, was on camera. I fly a lot for work, Angela said in the interview, and I've seen this kind of thing happen before. But I've never seen a CEO actually do something about it in real time. Most companies would have swept it under the rug. But David Chen stood up and said this is wrong. That took guts. The article also mentioned Jonathan, though he had declined to be interviewed. The passenger who was discriminated against is a well-known technology entrepreneur worth billions of dollars, the article said. He has chosen to remain publicly anonymous but has agreed to work with Skyline Airways on improving their policies. David's phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello, Mr. Chen, this is Rachel Washington from Good Morning America. We would love to have you and your passenger on our show tomorrow morning. We can send a car to pick you both up at 5 a.m. I'll have to ask him, David said. Can I call you back? He texted Jonathan. Good Morning America wants us both on the show tomorrow. What do you think? Jonathan replied almost immediately. Let's do it. But I have conditions. I want to talk about systemic racism, not just this one incident, and I want to announce our partnership. Deal, David texted back. That night, David barely slept. He kept working on policies and plans. He drafted an email to send to all Skyline Airways employees. He started reaching out to diversity trainers and consultants. At 4:30 the next morning, a car picked him up from his hotel. Jonathan was already in the car, looking fresh and awake despite the early hour. He wore an elegant suit and that same calm, confident expression. Ready for this? Jonathan asked, honestly. I'm terrified, David admitted. I've done interviews before, but never about something like this. Just be honest, Jonathan advised. That's all anyone wants, honesty. The Good Morning America studio was bright and busy. Makeup artists and producers rushed around. David and Jonathan were led to a green room to wait. A producer came in to brief them. So we'll start by showing the videos from the flight. Then we'll bring you both out. Rachel will ask about what happened and what you're doing to fix it. We have about 10 minutes total. Sound good? Sounds good, David said. His mouth felt dry. At 7:15, they were called onto the set. The lights were blindingly bright. Rachel Washington sat across from them, smiling warmly. Good morning, she said. David Chen, CEO of Skyline Airways, and Jonathan Rivers, CEO of River Tech Solutions. Thank you both for being here. So Jonathan had agreed to use his real name after all. David glanced at him and Jonathan gave a small nod. They were doing this together. Rachel turned to the camera. If you haven't seen the viral videos yet, let's take a look at what happened on Skyline Airways Flight 447 2 days ago. The video played on monitors around the studio. David watched it again, seeing Patricia question Jonathan, seeing himself walk up to first class, seeing the moment he announced who he was. It was strange to see himself on video, confronting discrimination in real time. When the video ended, Rachel turned back to them. David, that must have been difficult to witness on your own airline. It was heartbreaking, David said honestly. I started Skyline Airways because I wanted to create a better flying experience. But clearly I failed. Discrimination was happening right under my nose and I didn't see it. Jonathan, what was going through your mind during that confrontation? Rachel asked, honestly. I was tired, Jonathan said. Tired of having to prove I belong in spaces I've paid to be in. Tired of being seen as suspicious just because I'm black. Tired of having to stay calm and polite while being treated like a criminal. But you did stay calm, Rachel observed. I've had a lot of practice, Jonathan said with a sad smile. When you're a black man in America, you learn very young that getting angry just makes things worse. So you smile, you show your papers, you prove yourself over and over, but you shouldn't have to do that. No one should, Rachel nodded. David, some people are saying you only took action because Jonathan is a billionaire. That if he had been a regular passenger, nothing would have changed. What do you say to that? David had expected this question. I understand why people think that, and I can't prove them wrong with words. All I can do is prove them wrong with actions. The changes we're making at Skyline Airways will apply to every passenger, regardless of who they are or how much money they have. We're creating systems to prevent discrimination and respond to it quickly when it does happen. Let's talk about those changes, Rachel said. What specifically are you doing? David explained the new policies, the mandatory bias training, the zero tolerance policy, the passenger advocacy hotline, the diversity advisory board. And I have an announcement, David added. Jonathan Rivers has agreed to join our board of directors. He's also investing in Skyline Airways. We're forming a partnership between our two companies to make the airline industry more equitable and inclusive. Rachel looked surprised. So Jonathan, despite what happened to you, you're still willing to invest in this airline? I'm investing because of what happened, Jonathan corrected. David could have handled this the way most CEOs would, with apologies and payments and quiet settlements. Instead, he took immediate action. He admitted the problem publicly. He's committing to real change. That's the kind of leadership we need. But do you trust him? Rachel asked. Jonathan looked at David. I'm choosing to trust him, but I'm also choosing to hold him accountable. If Skyline Airways doesn't follow through on these promises, I'll be the first to call them out. And I would expect nothing less, David said. Rachel smiled. It sounds like you two have formed an unlikely partnership. It's not that unlikely, Jonathan said. We both want the same thing. An airline where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring people together. After the interview ended, David and Jonathan were flooded with requests. Other news shows wanted them. Podcasts wanted them. Business magazines wanted them. But David said no to most of them. We need to focus on the actual work, he told Jonathan. We can do more interviews later after we've made progress. Over the next few weeks, David barely left his office. He worked 16-hour days, completely rebuilding his company's approach to diversity and inclusion. He hired Dr. Amara Johnson, a renowned expert on bias in the workplace, to design a comprehensive training program. Unlike typical corporate training, this program was interactive and challenging. Employees had to confront their own biases. They had to role-play difficult situations. They had to hear stories from passengers who had experienced discrimination. David personally attended every training session. He wanted his employees to see that this mattered to him. The passenger advocacy hotline went live 2 weeks after the incident. It was staffed 24 hours a day by trained professionals who could respond immediately to complaints. In the first month, they received over 200 calls. Some were legitimate complaints about discrimination. Others were misunderstandings that could be quickly resolved. But every single call was taken seriously. David fired 3 employees in the first month. One had made racist comments to a passenger. Another had discriminated against a Muslim family. A third had refused to help a disabled passenger and made rude comments. Each termination was thoroughly investigated and documented. But David also recognized employees who did the right thing. James, the flight attendant who had spoken up, received a promotion. David created a new position, Director of Passenger Experience, and gave it to an experienced black woman named Denise Carter, who had been passed over for promotions multiple times despite excellent performance. The Diversity Advisory Board met every 2 weeks. It included Jonathan, James, Angela, the woman who had recorded the videos, Dr. Johnson, and several other passengers and employees. They reviewed complaints, discussed problems, and proposed solutions. One of their first recommendations was to change how Skyline Airways handled passenger complaints. Previously, complaints went through multiple layers of management and often got lost. The new system was direct and transparent. Every complaint was tracked. Every complainant received updates. Every resolution was documented. David also started flying on his own planes regularly, always in disguise. He sat in economy, in business class, in first class. He watched how crew members treated different passengers. Sometimes he saw good things, flight attendants going out of their way to help people. Other times he saw problems that needed addressing. After one flight, he fired a gate agent who had been rude to an elderly Asian couple, speaking to them, loudly and slowly like they were children, even though they spoke perfect English. After another flight, he gave a bonus to a flight attendant who had defended a transgender passenger from rude comments by another passenger. The changes didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks and challenges. Some employees resisted the new training. Some complained that David was being too strict. A few quit, saying they didn't want to work for a politically correct airline. David let them go. He would rather have fewer employees who shared the company's values than more employees who didn't. Meanwhile, the story continued to spread. The videos from Flight 447 were viewed over 50 million times. News outlets around the world covered the story. Other airlines started examining their own policies on discrimination. Some airlines announced new training programs, clearly copying what Skyline Airways was doing. David didn't mind. If our crisis leads to positive change industry-wide, that's a good thing, he told reporters. 3 months after the incident, David sent the promised email to every passenger who had been on Flight 447. The email included detailed information about everything Skyline Airways had done, the training program, the hotline, the advisory board, the policy changes, the new hires and promotions. I made you a promise, David wrote. I promised to create real change. I hope this email shows you that we're keeping that promise. But we're not done. We'll keep working, keep learning, and keep improving. Thank you for holding us accountable. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of passengers replied. Most were supportive and impressed. A few were still skeptical. Some shared more stories about discrimination they had witnessed or experienced. David read every single email and responded personally to many of them. 6 months after the incident, Skyline Airways won an award from the NAACP for corporate leadership in civil rights. David and Jonathan accepted the award together. This award doesn't belong to us, David said in his acceptance speech. It belongs to every passenger who spoke up, every employee who told the truth, every person who demanded better. They're the real heroes. 1 year after the incident, Skyline Airways released its first annual diversity report. The report included detailed statistics on hiring, promotions, complaints, and resolutions. It also included areas where the company was still struggling and plans for improvement. Other companies praised the transparency. Most corporations hide their diversity problems, wrote a business journalist. Skyline Airways is putting everything out in the open. That takes courage. Bookings at Skyline Airways increased by 30% that year. Exit surveys showed that passengers felt safer and more respected on Skyline Airways flights compared to other airlines. Employee satisfaction scores also went up, but David knew the work wasn't finished. Discrimination didn't disappear just because you created new policies. It required constant vigilance and constant effort. Patricia, the flight attendant who had started everything, tried to sue Skyline Airways for wrongful termination. The case was quickly dismissed. The judge ruled that the company had every right to fire an employee who discriminated against passengers. David heard that Patricia had trouble finding work in the airline industry after that. Part of him felt bad for her. But mostly he believed she had faced the consequences of her actions. 2 years after the incident, David and Jonathan appeared on Good Morning America again. So tell us, Rachel Washington said, was it worth it? All the work you've put into changing your company? David didn't hesitate. Absolutely, we're not perfect. We still make mistakes, but we're better than we were, and we'll keep getting better. Jonathan, do you still fly Skyline Airways? Rachel asked. Jonathan smiled. I fly Skyline Airways whenever I can, not just because I'm on the board and own part of the company, but because I genuinely feel respected when I fly with them. That's worth a lot. Any final thoughts? Rachel asked. David looked at the camera. To everyone watching, I want to say this. If you witness discrimination, speak up. If you experience discrimination, report it. Don't stay silent. Change only happens when we demand it. Jonathan nodded. And to companies out there, you don't have to wait for a crisis to do the right thing. Start examining your policies now. Start listening to your employees and customers now. Don't wait until you're trending on Twitter. The interview ended and David and Jonathan walked out of the studio together. You know, Jonathan said, when I boarded that flight 2 years ago, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Me neither, David admitted. I thought I was just going to observe some flights and go back to my office. Instead, my whole life changed. Do you regret it? Jonathan asked. David thought about the long hours, the difficult conversations, the employees he had to fire, the criticism he had faced. Then he thought about the passengers who told him they felt safe flying now, the employees who felt empowered to speak up. The positive changes spreading through the industry. Not for a second, David said. Not for a single second. They shook hands one more time, then went their separate ways. David back to his office to continue the work of building a better airline. Jonathan back to his company to continue pushing for change in the technology industry. But their partnership continued. And the story of Flight 447 lived on, inspiring other companies and other leaders to do better. Because sometimes, the worst moments really do lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force us to see problems we've been ignoring. And sometimes when good people choose to do the right thing despite the cost, real change becomes possible. That was the real lesson of Flight 447. Not that discrimination had happened. That was sadly common. But that when it did happen, people stood up. People spoke out, people demanded better, and in the end, they got it.